I never imagined that my own job, the one that had cost me so much effort to achieve, would become the scene of a humiliation that I would never forget. It all started on a typical Madrid night in October, when the leaves fell softly on the cobblestone streets of the Salamanca neighborhood. The restaurant where he worked, El Rincón de Isabel, was one of those places that exuded elegance without being pretentious. The terracotta-colored walls, adorned with paintings of Spanish landscapes, created a cozy atmosphere that perfectly complemented the low lighting and soft Spanish guitar music that wafted through the air. He had been working there exactly 8 months and 3 weeks. I remember it perfectly because each day represented one step closer to my goal, finishing my business administration degree at the Complutense University. Waitressing was not what I had dreamed of doing, but it allowed me to maintain my independence and help my family, especially my younger sister, Lucia, who was still in high school. My routine was quite predictable. I would arrive at 5 in the afternoon, put on my black uniform with the restaurant's characteristic burgundy apron, and begin preparing the tables for the night service. My colleagues, Maria, the other waitress on the evening shift, Pedro, the bartender who always had a smile for everyone, and Jorge, the chef who had worked in several Michelin-starred restaurants, had become my second family. On this particular night, the restaurant was busier than usual. It was Friday, and it also coincided with an important gastronomic fair in the city that attracted many diners to the neighborhood. I was in the middle of taking the order of a French tourist couple when I saw her enter, Carmen Velasco, my boyfriend Alejandro's mother, with her characteristic aristocratic bearing and that air of superiority that had always made me uncomfortable. And next to her, to my surprise, was Alejandro. My heart skipped a beat. Alejandro knew I worked here. In fact, we had met when he came to dinner with some college friends, but he had never come to see me during my shift. His mother, on the other hand, had no idea that her son was dating a simple waitress, as she would surely label me. Alejandro had always avoided mentioning it, knowing his mother's elitism. I quickly finished with the French tourists and headed towards their table, trying to maintain the professional composure that the restaurant demanded. As I walked, I remembered all the times that Alejandro had spoken to me about his mother, widow of an important businessman, raised in the best schools in Madrid, and with a very particular opinion about the social classes that, according to her, should remain in their place. "Good evening, welcome to El Rincón de Isabel," I said with my best professional smile, although inside my stomach was twisting with nerves. Alejandro looked at me with a mixture of surprise and concern, while his mother looked up from the letter with that expression that only those who consider themselves superior to the rest of the world can have. The moment his eyes landed on me was like watching a storm brewing in slow motion. First came surprise, then recognition. I had seen myself in photos with Alejandro on Instagram, and finally, the purest contempt I had ever witnessed. Her lips, painted a deep red that contrasted with her pale skin, curled into a grimace of disgust. "Is this the girl you told me about, Alejandro?" he asked in a tone that made it seem like he was talking about some kind of insect. He didn't wait for his son's response before continuing, "A waitress? For God's sake, son, couldn't you find something better? What will your aunt say? What will the people at the club say?" The silence that followed was deafening. The soft music of the restaurant seemed to have faded, and I could feel the gazes of nearby diners boring into my back. Maria, who was nearby serving wine, stopped short. Pedro, from the bar, pretended to clean a glass while observing the scene with concern. Alejandro turned red as a tomato and started babbling something, but I couldn't hear him anymore. The ringing in my ears was too loud, and I could feel the heat rising up my neck to my cheeks. Years of building self-esteem, of reminding myself that work is dignified, that I was pursuing my dreams, seemed to crumble under this woman's contemptuous gaze. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me when I was little: dignity is not inherited, it is built. And in that moment, I decided that I would not allow this woman, with all her money and her prejudices, to make me feel less than. With a calmness I didn't know I possessed, I maintained my professional posture and responded, "Yes, Mrs. Velasco, I am a waitress. I am also a final-year business administration student, I speak 3 languages, and I support myself. May I take your order, or do you prefer that I call my colleague? The answer seemed to throw her off for a moment. Clearly he didn't expect a simple waitress to stand up to him, and even less so with such politeness. Alejandro looked at me with a mixture of pride and shame, while his mother seemed to be processing the fact that she had just been put in her place by someone she considered inferior. The rest of the night was an awkward dance of furtive glances and pent-up tension. Every time I approached the table, I could feel Carmen Velasco studying me, looking for any mistake, any excuse to confirm her prejudices. But I remained professional, helpful and polite, even though inside I was shaking with rage and humiliation. The other restaurant customers, who had witnessed the scene, treated me with extra kindness, as if wanting to compensate for that woman's cruelty. One older lady even left me a generous tip with a note that said, "Don't let anyone turn off your light, honey." When my shift finally ended, I found Alejandro waiting for me at the back door of the restaurant. His mother had long left, but not before making a comment about how the quality of service wasn't what it used to be. Alejandro had that scolded puppy expression he got when he knew something had gone terribly wrong. "I'm so sorry, Anna," he started to say, but I interrupted him by raising a hand. "Don't apologize for her, Alejandro. Everyone is responsible for their own actions," I told him as I took off my apron and let my hair down. "But I need you to understand something, I am not ashamed of my work. I am ashamed of people who think they can treat others as if they are less because of the work they do." That night, as I walked home through the streets of Madrid, with the October cold biting my cheeks, I thought about all the people who, like Alejandro's mother, judge others without knowing their stories, their struggles, their dreams. I thought about my colleagues at the restaurant, about the students who like me work to pay for their studies, about all those who get up every day to earn an honest living. The humiliation I felt that night didn't fade immediately, but it transformed into something else: determination. Determination to demonstrate that a person's worth is not measured by their job or their bank account, but by their dignity and their ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. As I opened the door to my small shared apartment in Lavapiés, where the noise of the city never seemed to completely sleep, I made a decision: the next time I met Carmen Velasco, I wouldn't be like the waitress she had tried to humiliate. It would be like someone who has a surprise in store, a card up their sleeve that would completely change the rules of the game. At that moment, as I watched Carmen Velasco's arrogant expression, something inside me clicked. Maybe it was the memory of all the nights I had spent studying after long days at work, or maybe the image of my father telling me to never let anyone make me feel less than. What I do know is that, in that moment, I decided it was time to reveal the truth I had been holding onto for so long. I approached the table with the confidence of someone who knows their true value. The restaurant was still full, with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses as background music. Pedro winked at me from the bar, as if he knew what was about to happen. He was one of the few who knew my secret. "Mrs. Velasco," I began, calmly adjusting my apron, "I see you are enjoying our Rioja Gran Reserva. It is an excellent choice. In fact, I selected that wine myself for our menu when we added it 3 months ago." Carmen looked at me with a mixture of confusion and disdain. Alejandro, who was taking a sip from his glass, stopped halfway. I continued with a serene smile, "You see, there's something I haven't told anyone, not even your son. This restaurant isn't just my workplace. I'm a co-owner." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, even the background music seemed to stop. Carmen Velasco blinked several times, as if she was processing what she had just heard. Her wine glass was suspended in the air, forgotten halfway to her crimson lips. What are you saying?" he finally managed to articulate, his voice losing that tone of superiority that he had maintained until then. I sat in the empty chair at their table, something I would normally never do during the service, but this situation called for it. 3 years ago, I began to explain. When I started working here as a waitress, the restaurant belonged to Don Manuel Ruiz, a wonderful man who had kept this place going for 30 years. I was a first-year business administration student and, in addition to waiting tables, I started helping him with the accounting. Alejandro was staring at me, his brown eyes full of wonder. I had never told him this part of my story, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had never felt the need to brag. Don Manuel became my mentor, I continued. He taught me everything about the restaurant business, from selecting suppliers to managing staff. One day, he confessed to me that he was thinking about retiring, but was worried about the future of the restaurant. He had received offers from large chains that wanted to convert El Rincón de Isabel is just another generic restaurant. I paused for a moment to pour more wine into their glasses, a gesture that now had a completely different meaning. So, I continued, he made me a proposal that would change my life. He offered me the opportunity to buy a part of the business. Of course, I didn't have the money, but he helped me get a loan and gave me the option to pay my part with work and benefits. Carmen Velasco had regained some of her composure, but her expression was completely different. There was no longer contempt in his eyes, but a mixture of disbelief and something that looked like reluctant respect. For 2 years, I continued, I worked double shifts. I studied in the mornings, worked in the afternoons and evenings, and on weekends I dedicated myself to learning everything I could about restaurant management. Every penny I earned went toward to pay my share of the business. My current partner, Luis, Don Manuel's son, and I took over completely 6 months ago, when Don Manuel finally retired. Alejandro ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he always did when he was processing important information. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, his voice laced with amazement and a hint of reproach. "I didn't want it to be the first thing people knew about me," I answered honestly. "I preferred to be known for who I am, not what I have. Plus," I added, looking directly at Carmen, "I've learned that there are people who judge others based on appearances and social labels. Being just a waitress has allowed us to see the true nature of many people." The impact of my words was evident on Carmen's face. Her cheeks turned a deep red, and for the first time since he had known her, she seemed speechless. His son, meanwhile, looked at me with a mixture of pride and admiration that I had never seen before. "The restaurant has been profitable since day one," I continued, now speaking like the businesswoman I was. "We have maintained the essence that Don Manuel gave it for 3 decades, but we have also introduced changes. We renew the menu every season, we work with local and seasonal products, and we have established relationships with small wine producers throughout Spain. Our philosophy is maintain tradition while adapting to new times." I stood up from the table, straightening my apron with an automatic gesture. "And yes, I'm still waiting tables," I added with a smile. "I like to maintain direct contact with customers. It helps me better understand their needs and constantly improve our service. Plus," I added with a touch of humor, "it reminds me of where I come from and where I'm going." The rest of the night passed in a surreal atmosphere. Carmen barely touched her dinner, while Alejandro alternated between looking at me in amazement and casting accusatory glances at his mother. The other diners, who had witnessed the previous scene, were now observing me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. When my shift ended, I changed out of my uniform and met Alejandro at the door. His mother had left earlier, mumbling something about a headache. We sat on one of the benches in the Plaza Mayor, the night lights of Madrid creating an intimate atmosphere around us. "I can't believe you own the restaurant," Alejandro finally said, breaking the silence. "All this time, I thought you were working to pay for your studies." "And I was," I replied. "But I was also building my future. Don Manuel taught me that opportunities don't always come in the package we expect. Sometimes we have to create our own opportunities." "My mother," Alejandro began, but I interrupted him. "Your mother acted on her prejudices," I said softly. "But I hope you learned something tonight." Not about me or the restaurant, but about not judging people by their job or their social standing. We were silent for a moment, watching the tourists and locals still strolling through the square despite the late hour. The lights of the historic buildings created dancing shadows on the cobblestones, and the fresh air of the Madrid night enveloped us like a blanket. "You know what's the funniest thing?" I finally said. "Your mother has been coming to the restaurant at least once a month for years. She always orders the same wine and always compliments the chef on the food. She never realized that the simple waitress her son dates was actually the person who had helped create the dishes I enjoyed so much." Alejandro laughed, the sound echoing in the almost empty square. "That explains why he always insisted on coming here for his business dinners. He said it was the only place where the service was acceptable." "Acceptable service from a simple waitress," I joked, though there was a hint of bitterness in my voice. "Hey," Alejandro said, taking my hand. "You are so much more than that. You always have been." "I'm sorry my mother couldn't see it sooner." "It doesn't matter," I replied, squeezing his hand. "The important thing is that now you know the truth. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see someone working in service, you'll think twice before you judge." As we walked home, under the starry Madrid sky, I thought about how unexpected truths have the power to change perspectives. The humiliation that Carmen had tried to inflict on me had become my moment of triumph, not because owning the restaurant made me a better person, but because I had shown that appearances can be deceiving and that a person's true value is not in their work or their title, but in his character and his actions. The silence that followed my revelation was so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Carmen Velasco, who moments before had been so sure of her superiority, now looked like a pillar of salt, frozen in her seat with the glass of wine halfway to her lips. The restaurant continued to function around us, but at our table time seemed to have stopped. I decided to continue with my work as if nothing had happened. I walked away from the table with a firm step, although I could feel the gazes of mother and son on my back. I headed to the kitchen, where Jorge, our chef, was waiting for me with a knowing smile. "You finally told him, huh?" he whispered as he prepared the dishes for another table. "It's about time that lady learned a lesson." I smiled back as I picked up the plates for table 6. "Sometimes the best lessons are the ones we don't expect to give," I responded, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and nervousness. From the bar, I watched as Alejandro tried to have a conversation with his mother. Carmen was muttering something under her breath, her face alternating between red with embarrassment and pale with shock. His son responded quietly, gesturing with his hands in that way he always did when he was nervous. Maria approached me while I was preparing a gin and tonic. "Are you okay?" he asked, placing a lemon on the rim of the glass. "You've been keeping that secret for a long time." "I'm fine," I replied, although my heart was pounding. I just didn't expect that's how everyone would find out. The truth was that I had imagined 1,000 times what it would be like to reveal my position in the restaurant. Maybe at a quiet dinner with Alejandro, or maybe at a chance meeting with his family. I never thought it would be in the middle of an attempted public humiliation. When I returned to their table with the main courses, a roast suckling pig for Carmen and a salted sea bass for Alejandro, silence was still the main guest. Carmen barely looked at me, as if my presence was too much to process. Alejandro, on the other hand, kept looking at me with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "The sea bass is from the Vigo fish market," I explained as I served the dishes. "It arrived this morning. And the suckling pig is from a small farm in Segovia that I met last year during a work trip." Carmen picked at her food without saying a word, while Alejandro tried to maintain a normal conversation. "The fish is incredible," he commented after taking a bite. "Did you choose the supplier?" "Yes," I replied, allowing myself a small smile. "Don Manuel taught me that the quality of the ingredients is as important as the preparation. I spent 3 months visiting different markets and suppliers before deciding on this one. Carmen looked up from her plate for the first time. Don Manuel. He murmured, and I could see the recognition in his eyes. Manuel Ruiz. Of course. He was an old friend of your father, right? He asked, addressing Alejandro. Yes, Mom, he replied. In fact, he was the one who recommended I come here the first time I met Ana. Another awkward silence settled at the table. I realized that Carmen was connecting the dots, remembering all the times she had frequented the restaurant, all the times she had bragged to her friends about knowing the owner of one of the best restaurants in the area. Desserts will be ready in a few minutes, I announced, more to break the silence than out of necessity. Today we have a special Santiago cake, a recipe from Don Manuel's grandmother. As I walked away, I could hear Carmen whisper to her son, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Alejandro's response was just as soft, but clear, "Because I didn't know, Mom." And even if I had known, would I have changed anything? The tension in the atmosphere was so palpable that even the customers at nearby tables seemed to notice it. Pedro, from the bar, motioned to me asking if I needed help, but I shook my head. This was my battle, and I needed to fight it alone. During dessert, Carmen tried to regain some of her usual composure. The restaurant seems to be well run, he commented in a tone that was intended to be casual. I guess you must be proud. I am, I replied simply. But not just because I'm a co-owner. I'm proud of every step that brought me here, including being a waitress. Alejandro took my hand across the table, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by his mother. His eyes stopped on our clasped hands, and for a moment I saw something different in his gaze, understanding? Repentance? It was difficult to say. Dinner continued in a strange limbo between tension and resignation. Carmen barely touched her dessert, while Alejandro tried to maintain a normal conversation, asking me about the details of the business, about how I had managed to keep the secret for so long. It wasn't really a secret, I explained. It just wasn't something I felt the need to advertise. I preferred people to know me for who I am, not what I have or what I do. Carmen looked up from her glass of wine. But you work as a waitress, she said, and although her tone was no longer dismissive, there was still confusion in her voice. As the owner, you could just sit in an office and give orders. I completed his sentence. I could, yes. But this business was built on hard work and direct contact with customers. I don't see why that should change just because I now have a title to the property. The rest of the night passed in a kind of awkward dance. Every time I approached the table, Carmen seemed to shrink a little, as if my presence reminded her of her error in judgment. Alejandro, for his part, seemed to be seeing everything with new eyes, not only me, but also his mother. When closing time finally arrived, Carmen rose from the table with the dignity of someone trying to maintain her composure after a loss. Dinner was excellent, he said, avoiding my gaze. As usual. I'm glad you liked it, Mrs. Velasco, I responded professionally. I hope he comes back soon. Alejandro stayed behind while his mother headed for the exit. I can't believe you didn't tell me, he murmured, but there was no reproach in his voice, only amazement. There are a lot of things we don't know about the people we think we know, I responded, beginning to clear the table. Sometimes surprises can be good. After they left, I sat at the restaurant's empty bar, allowing myself to finally process everything that had happened. Pedro served me a glass of wine without me asking. You know what's most ironic? I said, more to myself than to him. All this time, she thought she was above me because of my job, when in reality I was part owner of the place she liked to show off that she frequented. Life has a funny way of putting everyone in their place, Pedro responded, wiping the bar with a rag. Although sometimes you need a little push. That night, as I was closing the restaurant, I thought about how a simple moment can change so many things. The most tense dinner of my life had served to put the cards on the table, literally and figuratively. There were no more secrets to keep, no more need to pretend to be less than what he was. The awkward silence that had dominated the evening was not just the result of Carmen's embarrassment or Alejandro's surprise. It was the sound of prejudices breaking, of presumptions falling, of truths coming to light. And although it had been difficult, it had also been necessary. As I walked home through the night streets of Madrid, I realized that tonight had marked a before and after. Not only in my relationship with Carmen and Alejandro, but in my own way of seeing things. Sometimes the most uncomfortable moments are the ones that lead to the most important changes. The awkward silence and the most tense dinner of my life had served more than just revealing my secret, they had served to demonstrate that appearances can be deceiving, that prejudices are barriers that prevent us from seeing the true worth of people, and that sometimes, the most important lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The next morning dawned gray over Madrid, as if the sky reflected the atmosphere that had established itself after that revealing dinner. I was in the restaurant office, reviewing the day's orders, when Maria poked her head through the door. "Ana, Carmen Velasco is here," she announced with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity. "He says he needs to talk to you." I took a deep breath, mentally preparing myself for what was coming. "Show her to the corner table," I replied, closing the supplier folder. "And please, bring us some coffee." Carmen appeared on the threshold of the office looking very different from the previous night. His usual aristocratic pose seemed somewhat diminished, although he tried to maintain his composure. She was wearing a cream-colored suit that contrasted with the dark circles under her eyes that her makeup had failed to completely hide. "Good morning," he greeted in a restrained voice. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," I replied, standing up from my desk. "Let's sit in the dining room, we'll be more comfortable." The restaurant was empty at that time of the morning, with only the cleaning staff preparing everything for midday service. We sat at the farthest table, the one we always reserved for important conversations or private meetings. "Alejandro doesn't know I'm here," Carmen began, nervously playing with the handle of her coffee cup. "In fact, he's barely spoken to me since last night." "I shouldn't blame him for my actions," she replied, trying to sound conciliatory. "No, you're right," Carmen admitted, surprising me with her candor. "It's not your actions that he's upset about, but mine." He paused, as if the words he was about to say cost him physical effort. "Look, Ana, I want you to understand that I'm not a bad person." "I've never thought it is," I answered honestly. "It's admirable what you've achieved," he continued, and I could see him struggling to find the right words. "A young, hard-working woman who has come this far on her own." "But," I interrupted gently, "I'm still the same person I was yesterday, when I thought I was just a waitress." Carmen had the decency to blush. "I see what you mean," he murmured. "It's just, I come from a different generation, you know. Where things were different." "Things are still the same, Mrs. Velasco," I responded. "The only thing that has changed is his perspective on them." Maria approached with a tray of freshly baked pastries, her silent way of showing support. The aroma of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air, creating a more homely atmosphere. "You know," Carmen continued after a long silence, "when Alejandro told me he was dating someone who worked in hospitality, I immediately thought of all the prejudices my own mother had instilled in me. Social classes don't mix, he used to say." "Times have changed," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "Yes, they have changed," he admitted. "But some of us resisted accepting it. You see, when I married Alejandro's father, he was already a successful businessman. I never had to work, I never knew what it was like to make a living for yourself." "Every person has their own path," I said, trying to keep a neutral tone. "But that doesn't justify my behavior," he quickly added. "Last night, when I found out that you were co-owner of the restaurant, I realized how ridiculous I had been. Not only for judging you without knowing you, but for assuming that a person's worth is in their title or social position. The sun was beginning to filter through the restaurant's windows, creating patterns of light on the white tablecloth. In the silence that followed, I could hear Jorge in the kitchen, preparing the bases for the day's dishes. You know what's most ironic? Carmen continued. This has been my favorite restaurant for years. I've brought my friends here, I've bragged about knowing the owner, I've recommended the dishes, and all this time, a part of that success was due to you, the person I considered inferior. The last words were pronounced with visible shame, as if he finally understood the weight of his prejudices. Mrs. Velasco, I began, choosing my words carefully, I appreciate you coming to talk to me. But I need you to understand something, I am no better person today than I was yesterday. I am no more worthy of respect for being a co-owner than for being a waitress. A person's value is not in their bank account or in their property title. Carmen nodded slowly, as if she was processing each word. Alejandro has always been better than me at seeing that, he admitted. He saw you for who you were from the beginning. And that says a lot about him, I responded. And the education he received. A flash of pride crossed Carmen's face at the mention of her son. Yeah, I guess we did something right, he murmured. Can I be completely honest with you? I asked, taking advantage of the moment of vulnerability. Carmen nodded, although I could see a hint of apprehension in her eyes. What hurt me the most last night was not his contempt for me as a waitress. It was to see how her prejudice could have deprived her son of a relationship that makes him happy. Doesn't he believe that Alejandro deserves to choose for himself who he wants to be, regardless of your work or social position? Carmen remained silent for several seconds, her eyes fixed on the cup of coffee already empty. You're right, he said finally. I have been so worried about maintaining appearances, so my club friends would say, that I almost ruined the happiness of my own son. It's never too late to change, I suggested gently. No, it's not, he agreed. Although it is not easy to unlearn prejudices of a lifetime. No one has said it's easy, I replied. But recognizing that there are those prejudices is the first step. Carmen straightened in her chair, recovering some of her usual composure, but this time without the arrogance that characterized her. Do you think Alejandro can forgive me? He asked with a vulnerability he had never shown before. Alejandro loves her, I replied sincerity. You just need to see that you are willing to change, to see it as the adult who is, capable of making your own decisions. And you, do you think you can forgive me? He asked, his voice just a whisper. It's not about forgiving, Mrs. Velasco, I replied. It's about moving forward. Building something new about the ruins of ancient prejudices. At that time, Jorge left the kitchen with a freshly baked croissants tray. The aroma of butter and puff pastry filled the atmosphere, breaking the tension of the moment. Would you like to try the new croissants? I offered. Jorge has been experimenting with a traditional French recipe. Carmen smiled, a genuine smile for the first time since she knew her. I would love, he replied. And please, call me Carmen. While we shared breakfast, we talked about lighter things, about the history of the restaurant, how I met Alejandro, of future business plans. Little by little, the tension was dissipating, replaced by something that, although it was not friendship, at least approached mutual respect. When he finally got up to leave, Carmen stopped for a moment. You know, he said, my mother would be horrified if I knew that I have been apologizing to with someone who works in hospitality. And that worries him? I asked. No, he replied with a little smile. And I think that is the first real step towards change. While I saw her get along the street, I thought about how people can surprise us. Sometimes, even those who seem more inflexible can find humility to recognize their mistakes and strength to try to change. Carmen's justification attempt had become something else. In a first step towards understanding, on a bridge lying on the abyss of social prejudices. It was not perfect, and we would probably have more uncomfortable moments in the future, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, an beginning is all we need. The following weeks at the restaurant were like walking on fine ice. The relationship between Alejandro and his mother had become tense, with short calls and less frequent visits. He could see how this affected Alejandro, who had always been very close to his family despite his differences. One afternoon, while we closed the restaurant, Alejandro appeared without prior notice. His face showed signs of fatigue, and I could notice that something worried him. "My mother has been calling the whole family," he said as he sat in the bar. He has been telling them his version of what happened here. Pedro, who was cleaning glasses nearby, launched me a look of concern before moving away discreetly to give us privacy. "And what version is that?" I asked, although I could already imagine it. "He tells them that her son is dating a successful businesswoman," she replied with a mixture of irony and frustration in her voice. As if that were the only important thing. As if your value as a person depended on owning the restaurant. I sat next to him, feeling the weight of his words. "And that bothers you?" "Of course it bothers me," he exclaimed, passing a hand through his hair. It is as if I had not understood anything. He still thinks in terms of social class and status, only now he has promoted in his scale. The restaurant was silent, just the buzz of the air conditioning as background music. Through the windows, we could see the Madrid lights on while the sun set. "This morning I had a strong discussion with her," Alejandro continued. "He called me to tell me that he had reserved a table at the field club to introduce you to her friends. Now you can be proud to present it in society," he told me. "And what did you answer?" I asked, although I could already imagine his reaction. I told him that I had not understood anything. That I was proud of you long before knowing that you were the owner of the restaurant. I fell in love with the person you are, not your bank account or your property title. His words warmed my heart, but they also saddened me. It was painful to see how Carmen's prejudices were affecting her relationship with her son. I also told him something else, he added after a moment of silence. I told him that if I could not respect my decisions and see beyond social appearances, we would have to rethink our relationship. "Alejandro," I started, but he interrupted me. "No, Ana. It is necessary. For years I have seen how people who consider inferior. His arrogance, of his need to maintain appearances." At that time, Maria approached 2 cups of coffee. Without saying a word, he left them in front of us and retired. The newly made coffee aroma filled the air, bringing a little warmth to the conversation. "Do you know what the worst is?" Alejandro continued after giving his coffee a sip. "That he is now calling all the acquaintances to show off his business water. As if that erased his previous behavior." "People do not change overnight," I replied softly. "Prejudices are deeply rooted." "But I should try," he insisted. "For me, for us." Instead, only the focus of their prejudices has changed. Now discriminates to others for not being successful businessmen like you. Alejandro's words made me think of how a single moment can trigger a series of events that affect all family relationships. The revelation in the restaurant had not only changed the way Carmen saw me, but had forced Alejandro to face aspects of her mother who perhaps had always preferred to ignore. "This morning," he continued, "I heard her talking with my Aunt Mercedes." "And that hurts you?" I asked, although the answer was evident in his face. "It hurts because he shows that he has not learned anything. He continues to measure the value of people for their money or their social position. And it hurts because, she is my mother, Ana. In spite of everything, she is my mother." The silence that followed was heavy, full of emotions not said. Outside, the night had fallen completely over Madrid, and the city lights shone like urban stars. "Do you know what else he told me?" he continued after a long silence. That now she knows that you are a businesswoman, she could introduce you to the children of her club friends, people of your level. As if suddenly they belonged to their privileged world. But that has never been my world, I replied. And I never want it to be. I know, Alejandro said, taking my hand. And that is part of what I love about you. Your authenticity, your ability to stay faithful to yourself regardless of circumstances. The following days were a whirlwind of calls and messages. The news that the waitress was actually co-owner of the restaurant had spread through Carmen's social circle as a fire in summer. I received invitations to social events, presentation cards from friends of the family, and even a proposal to join the exclusive field club. But the most difficult thing was to see how this situation affected Alejandro. His relationship with his mother had deteriorated significantly. The family meals of Sundays, which were previously sacred, had become tense and rare. One afternoon, while checking the restaurant accounts in my office, I received an unexpected call from Aunt Mercedes, Carmen's older sister. Anna, dear, his voice sounded warm through the phone. I need you to understand something about my sister. Carmen, she comes from a different generation, where appearances were everything. It does not justify her behavior, but maybe help to understand it. I understand it, I replied, but that does not make it less painful for Alejandro. I know, honey. And believe me, Carmen is also suffering. I had never seen Alejandro face her in this way. He is beginning to realize that her actions have consequences. Mercedes's words resonated in my mind for days. The consequences of Carmen's words go far beyond a simple humiliation in the restaurant. They had uncovered family tensions long ignored, had forced uncomfortable but necessary conversations, and had forced everyone to examine their own prejudices and values. One night, while we had dinner in my little apartment, Alejandro confessed something that left me thinking. You know, he said as he played with the remains of his paella, in a certain way, I should thank what happened in the restaurant. It helped me see my mother as it really is, not as I wanted to see her. And that is good. I asked. It is necessary, he replied after a moment of reflection. We cannot change what we do not recognize. And although it hurts, I prefer to see the truth than to live in an illusion. The consequences of Carmen's words continued to reverberate in our lives for months. Some family relationships cooled, others were strengthened. Alejandro began establishing clearer limits with his mother, defending his values and decisions with a firmness that he had never shown before. And I was still the same person who had always been. I continued working in the restaurant, serving tables when necessary, treating everyone with the same respect, regardless of their social position. Because in the end, the most important consequences of Carmen's words were not those that affected their social status or their public image, but those that forced everyone to face our own truths and values. 6 months after that night that changed everything, Isabel's Corner celebrated its 30th anniversary. We had organized a special dinner, with all the emblematic dishes that had made the restaurant famous over the years. Don Manuel had agreed to come as a guest of honor, and the place was full of regular customers, friends and family. Among the guests, of course, was Carmen. He had arrived early, dressed in elegance but without the ostentation that used to characterize it. The spent months had brought subtle but significant changes in their behavior, although the road had not been easy. The place is beautiful, he said as he accompanied her to her table, one that she had reserved specifically near the window, her favorite site. You have done a wonderful job with the decoration. Thank you, I replied, noticing how he had become accustomed to treating me as the same, although sometimes some gesture of his ancient attitude was still escaped. Maria and Pedro have taken care of most. When I mentioned my employees by name, I saw a flash of recognition in their eyes. He had learned to see people behind the uniforms, even if it cost him work. The evening began with an emotional speech by Don Manuel, who recalled the beginnings of the restaurant and how it had evolved over the years. When he mentioned me as the person who had helped keep the spirit of the place alive, I could see Carmen nodding slightly, as if finally understanding that the value of a person goes beyond their title or social position. You know, he told me later, when I sat for a moment at his table during a break in the service, I've been thinking a lot in these months. Ah, yes? I replied, genuinely interested in what I had to say. Yes. On that night, about my words, especially what has happened since then. He paused, taking a sip of his wine. I have learned more in these 6 months than in many years of my life. I watched her carefully, noticing the small wrinkles around her eyes that formed when she spoke with sincerity. She was no longer the same woman who had tried to humiliate me months. The other day, he continued, I was in the field club, and one of my friends began to speak derogatory of her new domestic employee. For the first time in my life, I found myself defending someone who works in service. Can you believe it? I smiled, remembering how much our relationship had changed since that first night. And what did you say exactly? I told him that the work dignifies, no matter what. We all deserve respect. He let out a small laugh. I think my friends thought I had drove me crazy. At that time, Alejandro joined us, sitting next to his mother. His relationship had also evolved in these months. The initial tensions had softened, although there were still uncomfortable times. What do they talk about? He asked, passing an arm through my shoulders. Your mother told me about her little revolution in the field club, I replied with a smile. Ah, yes, Alejandro nodded. He told me about that. It seems that finally some lessons have penetrated deep, right, Mom? Carmen nodded, and for a moment I could see vulnerability in her eyes. It has not been easy, he admitted. A lifetime of prejudices is not erased overnight. But I am trying, really. The night advanced, and the Bulia de Activity restaurant. From my position, I could see Mary attending the tables with their usual efficiency, Pedro preparing cocktails in the bar, and Jorge occasionally leaving the kitchen to greet the diners. All of them, people who Carmen before would have considered below of it, now they were individuals with their own names, stories, and dignity. Do you know what is most curious? Carmen said after a moment of reflection. That all this time I was so concerned about the what we'll say, to maintain appearances, that I lost myself to meet wonderful people. I lost myself to seeing the real value of the people. It's never too late to change, I replied, repeating the words that had told him months ago, but this time with a deeper meaning. No, it's not, he agreed. Although sometimes the change hurts. Sometimes it means facing your own prejudices, your own fears. Alejandro took his mother's hand, a gesture of affection that had become more frequent in recent months. I'm proud of you, Mom, he said gently. I know it hasn't been easy. At that time, Don Manuel approached our table. Carmen straightened instinctively, as if she were in front of an authority figure, but the old man greeted her with the same warmth with which she treated everyone. Carmen, he said with his leisurely voice, I'm glad to see you here. Ana has told me about the changes you've been making in your life. Don Manuel, she replied with a humility that months ago would have been unthinkable, her restaurant. Anna's restaurant has taught me more than I could imagine. Sometimes, the old man replied with a wise smile, the best lessons come from the most unexpected places. While watching them talk, I thought about how everything had changed in these months. Not only Carmen's attitude towards me or the restaurant staff, but also their relationship with Alejandro, his way of seeing the world, even his way of treating herself. The last lesson had not been just for her. We had all learned something in this process. I had learned about the power of forgiveness and the ability of people to change. Alejandro had learned to establish healthy limits with his family without losing love for them. And Carmen had learned that the value of a person is not measured by his work or his social position. Later that night, when the last guests had left and we were only the staff and family, Carmen approached me while cleaning the bar. "Anna," he said in a voice that denoted sincerity, "I never asked you for formally forgiveness for that night." "It is not necessary," I began to say, but she interrupted me. "Yes, it is. I need you to know that I am truly repentant. Not only for what I said, but for the person I was. For all the prejudices I had, for all the people to whom I have belittled throughout the years." I looked into my eyes, seeing sincerity in them. "I know," I simply replied. "And thank you," he continued, "for not allowing my words to define you. To stand firm who you are. You have been a better teacher than you imagine." That night, while closing the restaurant for the last time, I thought about everything that had happened in these months. How a moment of humiliation had become an opportunity for growth for all. How the words that had intended to hurt me had become the catalyst of a deep change. The last lesson had not been about money, social status, or business success. It had been about human dignity, about respect, about people's ability to grow and change. And perhaps, most importantly, it had been about the power to stay faithful to oneself, regardless of circumstances. While turning off the restaurant lights, I looked at the place that meant so much for me. The empty tables, the clean bar, the glasses shining under the last lights. Everything seemed different now, as if the space itself had witnessed our transformation. "List to leave?" Alejandro asked, who was waiting for me at the door. "Yes," I replied, taking his hand. "List for whatever comes." And while we walked through the night streets of Madrid, I knew that this was not really the last lesson. It was just the beginning of many more to come.